Sure. My primary responsibilities at WGU are to work with maintaining the quality of our assessments and evaluating and making suggestions for improvement.
All right. Well, we will go ahead and get started. The overview of this session is really for us to kind of take you through at a very high level what we do at WGU to deliver our assessments in higher ed. As everybody started to move a lot of their assessment in higher ed to an online platform, once the pandemic hit, we definitely started to get a lot of colleagues reaching out, asking us how we do it, you know, what are some key things to consider. From my perspective, the design and the development is some of the most important things that we fail to consider oftentimes in assessment. And that's something that I want to talk about with you guys today. And then also in the maintenance side, we have some really great tools from the field of psychometrics that Shelley will share that help us look at our assessment in some unique ways. And I think some of the considerations that we want to thread through this conversation are particularly related to assessment of diverse adult learners. When we talk about assessment in higher education, many of our students are above the age of 25. They are adults, they are coming to the table with prior experience. We want to keep that in mind as in everything that we do. And our diverse student population is a population that we want to ensure we are serving and providing a fair and equitable experience for all. So we are going to present all of our information with these three design, develop, and maintain pillars in mind. The first step that we spend a lot of time on at WGU, Andrea and I were just talking about how kind of hastily some people are having to put a lot of assessment online, right? We have the luxury at WGU of being able to take our time and do this in a very deliberate way. And the design is a process that we really hone in on in order to ensure that we are assessing in the most efficient way. So we are measuring what students absolutely need to know and be able to do. And that we're also ensuring that our assessments are valid. And backwards design is an approach that is not very complicated, but it's unique in some ways in that we start with defining our learning outcomes. And what that means is that we ask ourselves and our subject matter experts, what do students need to know to prepare them to enter the workforce? This is the phase in our discussions at WGU where we integrate some of the labor market data for our students, and we talk about what are the skills that are really in demand in the workforce, and what do we want to make sure our students are walking away with. And we define those up front. From there, we're able to define what that assessment should look like by asking ourselves, what does the application of these skills and competencies look like? We use evidence-centered design, and this is not a presentation about evidence-centered design, but that is something that we use then to define evidence statements. So what is the evidence that we need to gather to determine whether or not our students have these key outcomes, these key skills and competencies? And then we go to the design of the course. What are the materials that support achieving the proficiency in the assessment and these defined learning outcomes? And the reason why I really like this visual is that you can literally look at it and turn it over in your head. the traditional higher ed assessment model really goes the opposite direction. So the course is sort of designed, the instructor, the faculty member has the opportunity to really think about what they want to present to the students in the form of lectures and so on and so forth. They might think about what the assessment will be. And then at some point, this isn't probably the most linear process, but at some point they'll define the learning outcomes in the syllabus as required by the department. But it's sort of an inverted process traditionally in higher ed. And at WGU, we flip it over and we say we're doing a backwards design. We found that this really helps us design assessments efficiently, develop assessments efficiently. We know exactly what we're measuring in our assessments. And then our students are able to take that information and say, okay, these are the skills and the competencies that I have, and I feel confident that I have these. Okay. Now, that's kind of a very quick discussion of design. It's obviously a little bit more in depth than that. But once we get through the design phase and we know exactly what we want our course to look like, including the assessment, we start to develop our assessment items, or in some cases, performance assessments, which are more like projects or tasks. But in this case, we're talking more about your typical computer scored, multiple choice, multiple select type of an assessment. And one of the things that I wanted to share with this group today is one of the tools that we find to be very useful at WGU to ensure that our assessments are fair and valid for the adult learners that we have. Bias and sensitivity can be one of the biggest issues in assessment overall. And one of the things that I have found, having worked in K-12 assessment as well as higher ed and certification, is that higher ed, we tend to assess content that can sometimes be a little bit more subjective, especially in general education. We talk about some hot button issues in general education, right? In our critical thinking courses, our history courses, so on and so forth. We want to provide an authentic educational experience. However, in assessment, you really need to avoid the use of content that's potentially sensitive, biased, or in any other way unfair. And adult learners are going to be much more sensitive to this, and they are going to catch on to it. And the reason behind that is that when you're trying to measure a learning outcome, a skill, a competency, that is a construct that's very well defined. But if you're introducing content that maybe makes some people feel uncomfortable or makes them think of something else, that's what we call in assessment construct irrelevant variance. It's variance in your measurement that is not what you actually want to measure, but it will impact the way the item's performing, and it does impact what you're measuring. And so I wanted to share with you all today just a checklist that we use at WGU. This is information that is out there. It's not proprietary. This is kind of a combination of resources that we have put together, informed by some of the work done in the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium, the ETS guidelines that are out there, as well as our internal guidelines for assessment development at WGU. And as you can see, I'm not going to go through all of these, but what we're really looking at is at an item by item level. And whether you're developing assessments for 1,000 students or 10 students, you can do this checklist. You can ask yourself, does the item cause an emotional reaction? Is there something in the item that might cause an emotional reaction for certain groups of people? Does it contain anything that's potentially culturally or ethically loaded, potentially offensive or inflammatory in tone? Is there humor in the assessment items? That we want to be really careful of designing, universal design for instruction assessment. We need this to be accessible to all students, and some students who come from different backgrounds may not understand the humor in certain items. You know, use of stereotypes is another one that we want to screen out for. So this is just a kind of an applied tool that we suggest using in the early stages of development before you put content in front of students to screen, to kind of get that check, to ensure that we are providing the most fair and valid assessment of what we really want to measure, not the construct irrelevant variance, right? And again, I want to reiterate, this is a type of checklist that you can do for anything, whether it be a micro-credential assessment or an assessment in higher ed for a large seminar, thousands of students potentially online. So it runs that gamut. And let's see. Advance my slide. There we go. All right. Now, once you have your assessment in operation and in front of students, one really important thing that we do at WGU, which isn't necessarily something we see a lot in higher ed, but we really maintain our assessments, review them in an ongoing manner. This is something that we continuously do at WGU. We're not going to go into all the details of our metrics, but some of the things that we look at WGU, because we do have very high volume, are our pass rates for our assessments. You definitely don't want to have a pass rate that's so incredibly high that everybody's passing, or so low that it's very difficult. Decision consistency is a metric, a psychometric metric that we can use to determine the consistency of pass-fail decisions in the assessments. At WGU, we have multiple forms, so we look at this for all the different forms of the assessments, and that's the multiple forms as a way to ensure security of our assessments as well. Reliability, the average reliability of all the items across the forms. Same for discrimination. Discrimination not meaning discrimination in a negative way, but the degree to which the items can discriminate between a student who is competent and a student who is not. And then we have a bunch of factors that we look into for security of the assessment. Our assessments are secure. The students are proctored when they take our objective assessments, our computer scored assessments. And we look at the exposure of the item. So how long has this item been out there, operational? If it meets a certain criteria, we end up cycling those items out and putting some new ones in once they get too overexposed. And then the last one that I really want to highlight is differential item functioning. This is a statistical way to look at the fairness of an item, and it gets at that issue of, is there potential bias? And so I'm gonna hand it off to Shelley so she can talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of differential item functioning.
Thanks, Lauren. So out of that long laundry list that we were just looking at, most of those metrics fall in the psychometric wheelhouse. They are done with measurement professionals who use statistical programming to get answers to whether or not things are working and not. And then those statistical considerations have to be weighed in terms of policy. Is it right to have a pass rate of 90%? I mean, it is sometimes, and sometimes it's not. So the psychometrics team often works together to calculate statistics and do statistical tests, but the final decision about what to do with them is made by other people. And differential item functioning certainly falls into that sort of a metric. Differential item functioning, and we call it Diff for short, occurs when groups, and we'll talk about what groups are in just a minute, have different probabilities of answering an item correctly, that is endorsing it, but it's after controlling for the overall scores on the test. And that very important piece of information I'll be highlighting a little bit more closely. You do begin by looking at the average item scores for subgroups at the same overall score point. Let me show you what that means. Lauren, would you advance the slide? So if you imagine a large number of students taking a test, some of them will do poorly, some will do middling, some will do very well. And so the idea that begins Diff is, what if we control? What if we put the low performers together in category 1 and those who did a little bit better in category 2, and so on and so forth, till we get the very highest performers in category 10. And there are different ways that you can break these into groups. You can do them based on a more even number of students in each group. You can do it by percentiles. You can go for meaningful groups. But the important thing is that using the test score overall, you're controlling for student ability. So we're not going to compare weak performers with super high performers to see if the item is functioning properly. We need to level that playing field. And so once we've made these category distinctions, we'll go to the next slide, please, Lauren. And for every single item, then, all of the groups can be compared, and you can take a look at group A compared to group B. And it's nearly always two groups that we're interested in looking at. And the textbook terminology is a focus group and a reference group. And so how those are framed is up to the user. But in this particular example, we have a blue item that we see group B did a whole lot better than group A. We have a purple item where group A and group B did about the same. And then finally for group A, or in the yellow item, group A noticeably outperformed group B. And so those 10 categories have been divvied up into these particular items and the performance then compared. Lauren, the next slide, please. Now, the way that you conduct a Diff analysis is with a Mantel-Hansel statistical technique. There are item response theories methods that can be used. There's also logistic regression. These are statistical tools. I didn't think that now would be the time to break those out, but if you're interested in Diff, you might want to follow up on those. And the other important thing to note is, as Lauren mentioned earlier, WGU has some really large student cohorts, and sample size is important to ensure that the correct number of people in your groups is sufficient to be enough statistical power to detect Diff. On the other hand, if you have super large volumes, that can overwhelm and find maybe more Diff than you're interested in. So the knowledge of statistics is important in considering this particular technique. Next slide, please, Lauren. Yes. So I've been talking about groups, and quite frankly, groups can be anything that are of interest. I've seen studies where brown-eyed students were compared with blue-eyed. You can certainly do your left-handers versus your non-left-handers. But much of the work that Lauren and I have worked on over the last year or so has focused on some very timely sorts of comparisons and groups. And we have focused on female and male comparisons. We've also looked at minorities with non-minority groups. WGU tries to be very military friendly, and so we have done military and non-military comparisons. We've also done rural and urban comparisons at the urging of some of our course instructors who thought that that might be an important distinction. And so finally, the other thing that I wanted to leave you with, oops, one more thing, sorry. What do you do when you actually detect Diff? The computer program is run, you get a list of your test items, and you'll see varying degrees of Diff from none to mild to moderate to high level or extreme. And our practice has been to isolate the items with extreme Diff and try to evaluate what's going on behind that. The presence of Diff requires far more than a statistical program run. It requires review and judgment by the people that are using the items, namely the content experts, course instructors, and those folks who have the ability to make a judgment about the item. Because the identification of Diff doesn't necessarily identify bias. Bias is something that experts look at, and Lauren showed you that great checkoff list: emotional, stereotypes, other kinds of unfair evidence in an item that it doesn't show up in the statistical test. The test just shows if there's a difference of performance. And another way to think about it is that the item is performing in an unexpected way. Why all of a sudden are females performing better on this item than males, given that we're looking at females and males of the same ability? Next slide, please, Lauren. So this is what I thought would be a good conclusion. An example of two items that we have seen in our experience that showed Diff and that didn't show Diff, as the case might be. This particular item I grabbed off the internet. This was for a business ethics course. I changed a couple of names to kind of illustrate what we found in our live test items. And we have a situation with a little bit of context where John has been asked by his boss, Jane, to use some deceptive tactics in order to obtain information from the company's primary competitor. What should he do? Clearly, this is a business ethics question, and you have some solutions or some answer options that could be chosen. One is clearly the right answer. And when we saw items like this, we wondered amongst ourselves, is this because of the pronouns? Is it because there's any unclarity with regards to that? Is there a male-female dynamic that you have a male employee with a female boss? Would this be different if the roles were reversed? Would it be different if we had an employee who's been asked by their boss? No identification. So we struggle with the amount of content that should be included to have a reasonable scenario to make it a real life example versus is Diff being displayed. And out of many, many items, we saw several that would show Diff in items like these, but it got a little bit tricky because sometimes those would favor females, sometimes they would favor males, sometimes they would favor minorities, and so forth. So it was very difficult to pin down any kind of very clear sort of reason why Diff was occurring. And then we invested a great deal of time with subject matter experts and said, can you see a reason? Is there something in the pedagogy? Is there something in your practice that you've seen where females are more inclined to do this sort of thing, even if they know the business rule that's supposed to be the gist of this question? And the answer so many times was frustrating, but no, there really isn't anything that we can see as to why Diff might be present. And then another Diff example that I thought I would share. This is about as context-free as you can get. This is a calculus test item. It's asking about an inverse function. It has 4 different options that you may choose. And we saw items like this that would display female and male Diff. We saw minority and non-minority Diff and military and non-military Diff. We really could not understand why subject matter experts were not able to explain why this particular item. And then on top of that, there were a handful of other items that didn't show Diff, and yet they looked to be very similar in the subject matter, the context-free nature of the item, and so forth. So let me wrap up this very brief introduction to differential item functioning. It is one really great tool for assuring high-quality, fair assessments. It allows you to count items that have or display differential item functioning. And if you have item banks to support it, you can't just throw them away. You don't have to necessarily debate them or discuss them. So that you can remove items, and if there's a small number, that's not too problematic. On the negative side, Diff requires a larger sample sizes and some technological support. And then the interpretation of the items, as I mentioned now, can be time consuming and difficulty. And final reminder, Diff does show difference in performance between like groups, but it does not show bias. And that's a key thing that we are looking for in our assessments of our students and learners. So Lauren?
Take myself off mute. That concludes our presentation today. I know we have about just 3 minutes left or so, but I hope that provided some insight into how we design and develop and maintain our assessments at WGU. Really, these methods that we use at WGU are industry practice for assessment across the board. We're unique at WGU in that we have very high volume assessments. We have a lot of them, and we have a lot of resources to design, develop, and maintain. But these are all tools and things to think about for any type of assessment in higher ed. And so hopefully this was informative and useful. I think we have about 2 minutes. If anybody would like to ask a question, we're here.
Lauren, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, any questions, folks? And this was just full of rich information. Thank you. Feel free to post it in the chat. Otherwise, I just want to thank our presenters for sharing their work and their expertise. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks, everybody. Seeing great job and great presentation, and thanks and in the comments. Yeah, thank you both.
Thanks, guys.
Whoops. Congratulations on making it through with your internet.
Breathing a sigh of relief.
Awesome. Wow, that was fabulous. Really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. You did such a great job moderating this meeting. It must be fun just to pop in and see all kinds of different kinds of stories going on.
I am loving that. It is, it's been a long time since I've attended anything given the, the COVID situation because of and travel budgets, but this is fabulous. It's just really, really rich. So, well, have a great rest of your day. And thanks again. I hope it's not too involved and that you can take a breath.
It's all downhill from here for me.
All right.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.